Okay, so the idea of this morning was, first of all, to record you individually like you have just done. Thank you so much for doing that. We work out ways to use that material, and ideas that you have would be very welcome. But then this part was to really explore what's on your mind. You know, it's a private group, and where we want to feel free to express our thoughts, the thoughts that may have been in your mind yesterday, and concerns that you have around the future of Australian Aboriginal art, and concerns that you have around the way that Aboriginal art is situated in the art world generally, and especially how issues of Indigenous and non-Indigenous art can play out over coming years, and against the perspective of what's happened in recent decades, and lots of different aspects. And so I think just to start it, let's just, Henry, I'm going to pick on you. Tell us what's on your mind.
What's on my mind? Maybe a place to start with that question. I've reviewed this exhibition Crossing Country now twice. Once on my blog and then once for a magazine in Australia. And I guess the point that I raised in both of those pieces, as I see it, challenge, and the challenge that I saw you trying to address, all four of you trying to address last night, is how do we get around this thinking about Aboriginal art in terms of modernity? And to me, you know, even when we raise questions of aesthetics is, as you pointed out last night, essentially a modernist concept. It's a concept that, it's an analytic term that we use in art history a lot, but it's one that is very specific to our way of thinking. In fact, museums, another modernist invention, very specific to our way of thinking. And I guess the challenge that I'm constantly faced with is you know, Stephen put the call forward last night that it's not about westernising Aboriginal art, it's about indigenising museums, it's about indigenising. And I would say, you know, how can we stop thinking about Aboriginal art in terms of modernity and instead start thinking of a constructive contemporary frame that's broad enough to encompass all of these debates, and that totally shifts the discourse. It totally shifts the discourse from thinking how do we insert Aboriginal art into contemporary art, and instead of thinking how do we insert it, it starts thinking how do we make a big broad umbrella that that doesn't, you know, as I said in the catalogue essay, doesn't suggest that difference is a good thing, but suggests in fact difference is an essential thing. Difference, you know, we're not just looking at the persistence of difference, we're looking at the necessity of difference to all knowledge in the world, to our understanding of the world. So you know, how can we take all of these modernist frames and reshape them in meaningful ways that are robust enough to challenge the world? That's what we're trying to do here, isn't it?
So I think that's a great question, but what sort of answers are you formulating yourself for that position?
What's my answer? Well, if I knew the answer, it would be a very easy question. I don't really know the answer, and you know, for me, personally, I've been wondering whether we actually just have to stop having some of those discussions, whether we have to stop having discussions about aesthetics, right, whether we have to stop having discussions about you know, about westernising, whether we actually just need to start saying, whether maybe we just need to be a bit more bolshy. Maybe we just need to start saying, hey, you know, when is American art going to catch up to Aboriginal art? You know, when is Western contemporary art going to start working with the conceptual sophistication of Aboriginal art? I mean, maybe that's the question. I think that would probably surprise some panel. So I think that would probably surprise some audience members if you open with a question like that.
Anybody want to take that up?
I guess what makes me uncomfortable about all of this, whichever way, is it always seems to, and this happens a lot in the art world and in the museum world, things become a competition. And I understand that in some ways critics in museums are about sorting out value. But I would rather see it approached from a more generally explicative point of view. You know, my training in literature was structuralist, and it was about examining the artwork and looking to see what the inherent intrinsic qualities of the artwork are. And in order to explicate some of that, you obviously need the cultural references. You can't read Thomas Mann if you don't know the history of the First World War in Germany, and you can't talk about Shorty Jongala unless you understand that he's a custodian for rain dreaming and what that means. So you need the cultural context, but I would like to see the criticism focused more on the artwork itself and its inherent properties without playing is this better than the Mona Lisa sort of a game.
But, you know, I mean, Will, I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. But what I would argue is that it's in a power game whether or not it likes it. Museums are invented to instill a Western sense of power. I mean, the whole museum structure is a power structure. So if Aboriginal art is going to enter this game, I mean, part of what we know about Aboriginal art is political. It's in this game. So what I would worry about is if we fail to recognise that politics, both of the frame that we're seeing it in, and we recognise the politics of the frame that it's working in, we're kind of doing what museums are set out to do, which is to take things out of context, to pull them out of the political frames of reference. I mean, aesthetics is a classic example. Like, aesthetics is a program for removing things from culture. So I sense this in everything I read of yours, like the tension between that question of reading things as art and that question of reading the power that you rightly point out is in these works contextually. So the big question is how do we reconcile those two things?
I'm sensing a broader question here, which is given the successful entry of contemporary Aboriginal art into world exhibition markets, let's say, use that word, where to next in order to get to the points that you're making, Henry? So, any thoughts on that?
I think you should ask Bob. I think you've got strong opinions on this.
You know, what this discussion makes me think about is that there's a difference between the collectors and the institutions. And as collectors, we stake out our claim. We see something, we're interested in it, we buy it, we hope that it will receive institutional acceptance. If it doesn't receive institutional acceptance, we're hurt by that because it's kind of rejecting what we have chosen as something institutionally worthy. But the institution's goal is different than our goal. The institution's goal is, in our society, to survive. And to survive, it can't experiment too much, but it has to experiment some. And what we're trying to do is push that experimentation our direction. And what the institutions are saying is that's too much of a gamble for us. And how do we bridge that? And we have a foot in the door kind of thing. Because I don't think we're just talking about our collections. We're talking about the institution of Aboriginal art. That's something that we want to promote. And so that's kind of what I'm hearing as part of the discussion, and what I'm feeling is that there's a lot more distance between us as institutions and as collectors than I kind of thought there was. But you both have, we have different goals and
that I
incentives.
think is where the universities come in. That why Dartmouth is such an important step for us. For us, it was not so much that it entered the institution as a museum, was that it entered an institution that was dedicated to scholarship and learning. And I think that's, maybe to go back to what I was saying with Henry, that sort of exegesis and examination of the artwork is the first step, and that without that we'll never convince the broader institutional world that there is something interesting, to go back on what I said a moment ago, something of value there. And so being able to, I guess why I'm so pleased with Crossing Cultures is that it went from a private collector's passion to a university setting where it can be studied, and now being brought here, it's got that open door into the larger museum world through the sponsorship of the Toledo Museum.
Let me add a point or two here. One has to think about whether there are lessons to be taken from history. And I tend to gravitate toward that way of thinking about all this. So I say that as a preamble to our experience, Will's and my experience. We saw one show in New York, and we've said, we've been looking at contemporary American art now for 4 or 5 years, coming up to New York almost once a month. And it was tiresome. It was, for us, there wasn't any spark left. Now, there are lots of other people who at that time thought that period of American art was great, and they were purchasing contemporary art then. But we were, in some sense, tired of it. And then we see this show at the Asian Society, and we say, here is something that is exciting, visually exciting, because we didn't know anything about Aboriginal art, nothing. We just went to this show and we were excited by what we saw. So it started with seeing, not thinking, but seeing. And then we went over to Australia, rather naively, thinking, wow, we saw this art in New York City. This will be a wonderful holiday trip. We would go around to all the big cities, and we'd go to the museums, and we would be just bowled over by this kind of art. And guess what? There was nothing in the museums. Nothing. Now, that's not to say the museums didn't have collections in their basement, but nothing was exhibited. So that left us then, as we were thinking about it over the years, do we follow we follow our eye and our interest in whatever it is, and Will started to really understand the whole Aboriginal culture. Will delve deeply into that. I continue to be quite interested in, do I want to see this art or not, for whatever reasons. And then over the years, now let's get to the present here. Now if you go to Australia, and you want to see Aboriginal art, well, if you're lucky enough to start your visit in Melbourne, you go to the museum, and you see a fantastic show at the museum in Melbourne. If you happen to go to Sydney instead, that's another story. You might see something, you might not. If you go through the big galleries, you'll see 1 or 2 bark paintings hanging, maybe 3 bark paintings. So here is the country, Australia, where all of this art is coming from, and it isn't sorted out there. We're not going to sort it out here either. But what will happen, and this is where I say let's go back to history, you're going to find people who are not Australian who really fall in love with this art. And then we wait and see how it evolves. There are people in Europe that are very dedicated to this art, having museum shows and the like. Obviously, there's lots of museum shows those last 2-3 years in the United States. But it's not going to get anywhere on the intellectual side unless there are people who want to see it.
Which means the institutions have to be convinced that there are people who want to see it before the people want to see it.
But can I ask you though, I mean, you're setting up, this opticality or this aesthetic sense as, here's a question I'll pose to everyone. Is the aesthetic beauty of Aboriginal art an aid or a hindrance to it? If Aboriginal art had looked more like, if it had looked more like installation art and Joseph Kasuth and all of those artists that I imagine you didn't really like in the 70s and 80s, would it have been easier for that to have been accepted on an international art world level? And is in fact part of the problem that this is beautiful amongst
I would posit you could only answer that question after the fact. You can take any question like that and say, well, then what happened? Well, but I don't think you can do too much of forecasting as the way it will go. And the reason I'm saying that is because it wasn't possible to forecast all these great works of art that we go see when we travel around to see these great works in other places. They weren't great works, most of them, that's not true of all, but they weren't great works for lots of these innovative artists until way after the fact.
I think the museums and the art historians have come, rather late to appreciating Aboriginal art. Some of the first appreciators were more anthropologists and explorers who saw it as art, and wrote about it as art. I think that one of the things that is really a complicated question is, do we want to just subject it to a Western aesthetic, or really understand Indigenous aesthetics, really understand the meaning? I mean, people can certainly walk through the galleries and appreciate the work for its beauty and for the technical expertise that goes into making it, and any number of levels. But there's this kind of cultural translation as well that occurs that adds so much to it. So talking about museums the way that they're typically constructed, they sometimes will go into that kind of depth of contextualizing works, and sometimes not. And so I think it is a matter of examining the museum today as a setting, and maybe reinventing our idea of the museum too, our idea of art, so that we aren't so limited by one kind of style of looking at art, or an expectation. And really, I think that we tend to forget what we bring into our, every time we walk into the museum, all the baggage that we bring, what our expectation is. And in fact, that keeps some people away from museums anyway. That's I think a big kind of hindrance to different forms of art gaining, I don't know, a larger profile is that some people will never even go to museums to see that art. In Australia, you're going to see Aboriginal art everywhere, not just in the museum, you know, because it has been, you know, it's on currency, it's in the airports, it's, you know, everywhere you look, it's part of kind of, has been adopted as part of the national kind of design, really, in Australia. And so people, I think, are open to that. Here, you know, there's just so little knowledge. There's just so little experience that people have had with Aboriginal art. They literally walk into the museum to see Aboriginal art, and they don't know what they're going to see. They think they're going to see ancient art, or you know, primitive art. Yeah, and they're so blown away when they see, you know, something that they could, you know, imagine seeing at MoMA among other contemporary art. They just, that's not the expectation often.
What I'm concerned about most is really rooted in the education system. Jim Wright, when he was at Dartmouth, used to talk about the difference between certification and education, and that we really moved to certifying things rather than educating. And when one thinks of, say, a museum like the Toledo Museum of Art in its foundations around 1900, you have this very strong emphasis to educate people about cultures that they hadn't experienced. People hadn't widely traveled, and so for them, I mean, France and Italy was, in a sense, what Australia and Thailand might be to today. Not many people may have been there compared to, say, going to Europe. But at that stage, educating around knowledge that was outside of your purview was a big deal, and starting to collect for a museum like this was to collect from places that people hadn't experienced, but strongly Western in collecting. But there was also a very strong emphasis in the exhibition programming in the early decades to reach out to the rest of the world. And so when one puts that against today, you see that, for example, taking your point, Harvey, about history, I mean, having had, my children now are 23 and 19, so they've gone through school, and they've gone through school in Ireland and Australia and America. And it kind of stuns me that, you know, they can actually study the American Revolution without studying the French Revolution. And that the ladder of history, you know, the way that we used to learn, like, the history of the world, and for me, I grew up in Ireland, it was actually European society. That's all we really had to learn, and it was like one small chapter on America. There was really nothing on the rest of the world. And gradually we've learned how to tell our stories, but the stories are now so driven to individual study, and that we take these very partial aspects of history, and nobody has an understanding of the broader world history. And that seems to me to give the answer, that in the history books, and the particularly contemporary history, if in the schools, and starting off in the elementary schools and making one's way up through the schooling of the education system, before one ever gets to the university system, we have to be telling stories so that people experience art forms like Australian Aboriginal art in those textbooks early on, which of course are all going to be delivered electronically on smart boards. So there's a lot that you can pull. And only with that then can we begin to create the sense of, if you like, public appetite that you talk about, as will anybody want to see it. And so we're kind of, we're at this sort of sharp end of thinking that we're relevant, and yet the sea of our system is not really helping us much. And so I think, therefore, the answer, if they're among many, because there's never the right answer, just some ways of going, is that museums have to very, very wholeheartedly re-embrace the type of purpose that they had at their beginnings, which was within the art education system, within art appreciation before art history, and instead we hire art historians without emphasizing art history. So I think there's a real structural issue, and it's not just here in America, it's also in Australia, and it's also in Ireland. So we do our piece and hope that that has an impact, but this is a long and extensive story.
Yeah, non-specialist speaking here. The follow-up to that, and to your point, Harvey, is that just to be realistic, right, there are time frame implications there too. everyone's very eager to make a dent in this issue, but the prescriptions, to the extent those are, significant parts of the answers, occur over a decade or more, right? So this is not a battle that will be won in the short or even the medium term.
I think one of the things in this, as I frequently do, stealing an idea from Stephen, you were asking, where do we go? I think one of the opportunities that we have, as Stephen has pointed out, is there are ways of talking about this art in America that it's easier to do it than it is in Australia, because you can address the politics, you can address the history, you can address the social issues more openly. There's less angst, it's not as fraught a situation. And so perhaps one of the contributions that we can make here in America is to further that discussion, which to me opens up, again, I'll go back to the sort of need for scholarship, for explication, for exegesis, and for education in the sense that you've just outlined it. And I think if at the end of all of that we could get to where Margot was talking about, which is an explanation of indigenous aesthetics, ultimately being able to talk about this art from the perspective of the people who created it, or to somehow enable those voices to be heard, would be a fantastic contribution.
And we can do this. I think, what you're calling for is really more conversations with artists, and, we can do that. It's a matter of maybe applying our resources and our technology to do that, but I think that artists are willing to do that, and I think that one thing, we almost in a way stop short of that, because we kind of take this art out and put it in this sacred space and of the museum, and sometimes we don't invite the artist in as well. And think about any contemporary art show, you would have the artist here talking about their work. So I think that that's really an important part of it. Now, there are difficulties to overcome, travel and language and cultural, differences, but that's what I'd like to see more of, is if we really drill down and talk to the artists about what their intentions are, what they're showing us, and translate that for people.
Well, this is, as always, I mean, all of these points that are being raised are not either or kinds of points. We either do it this way or we do it that way, or we promote this, but don't. That isn't what it's all about, really. It's about all of these things, right? Every aspect that's been raised this morning are important elements if this kind of art is ever going to be looked at 50 years from today. Right? So all those things will count. But if the context of this session today, if the context is how do we get more people to see it in the United States, I'm not talking about Australia, right? We're not talking about Europe, but if the context is how do you get more people to see it, then the first thing that's obvious is it has to be seen in a museum. That's the only place where lots of people can see it. Right? Maybe there can be a TV show on public television for an hour where you see it.
Yeah, you need to get people to come to the museum in the first place, especially people who don't normally go to museums.
You need to get into the museum before people can come to the museum.
But I see, Margot, I'm not trying to refute what you said, but I'm going to just add personal history here for a second. When I first got interested in contemporary art, US brand of contemporary art, I had the opportunity of going to visit artists in their studios. I did that for a handful of times, and then I said, that's the last thing I ever want to do again. I don't want to hear what the artist tells me, because it doesn't really affect, first of all, my personal interest in that work. And I've come to find that most of the time, when you read about what an artist has to say in a journal, it's a joke. I mean, it's literally a joke. Not that you interpret it as a joke, but it just sounds funny, and it doesn't sound real. Yes, it makes interesting reading, and that's what it does, but it doesn't bring people to a museum. The things that bring people to a museum, by and large, is somewhere along the line, they get the notion that there's something interesting to go see, even if they haven't the foggiest idea of what it is. There was, Will can help me out on this, there was the artist who was in Australia for a while, not Australian, and her artwork was to sit in a chair for what, a couple of months? Yeah, and people went to see it like crazy. They stood in line to see it. Now, what is it they understood? I don't know what they understood, but the thing was, they wanted to see it. So I don't think it's hard. I mean, we've never bumped into people, maybe others of you have different experiences, but we've never bumped into somebody who said, I went to the show in Australia or in the United States, and there were a lot of Aboriginal works there, and God, was it boring. Nobody says that.
I have.
There you go. There's always one.
No, the first exhibit I saw, Margaret took me to, it was in a gallery in Seattle, and it just wasn't that interesting. And when we left, Margaret said, well, it was a terrible exhibit. And I didn't know. It was my exposure to Australian Aboriginal art. If I had not had a hammer behind me, Margaret, I probably wouldn't have looked again.
Sure.
And that's been a problem with Australian Aboriginal art. They've come straight out of the airports and gone into galleries in the States, instead of coming out of the museums and going into museums here where people get good quality work they can see. Even going to Australia, people, I've had people come back and say, we never saw anything like this in Australia. And, it's exposing people to what's good and what we think is good and what they think is good, apparently, because people respond to it if they see good quality and they're repelled by tourist quality art.
I agree. And I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't think I want to let pass just the idea that, for you, Harvey, obviously it didn't turn out to be good to engage the artist in the studio. But whether in the studio or elsewhere, the artist's voice, depending on the artist's desire to use the voice as opposed to their works, to comment on, talk about, explicate, and for some to kind of control, is just a reflection of society generally, that in any area people will operate differently towards their work. Some won't want to talk about it at all, and some want to talk about it at length. And here in the museum, we have found that over the last few years, we introduced this concept of the Master Series, which is a recovery from decades ago. And people really want to hear from the artist. And like most recently, Jaume Plensa was here, the Spanish sculptor, and 800 people coming to hear him talk. And he wasn't so much just talking about his work as talking about the effects that his work have in his experience. I think people are intensely interested in process. They want to know how an artist thinks, and they're kind of fascinated by that. And there are real challenges with Australian Aboriginal art that you've alluded to, Margot, you know, which is not just distance but of language and of circumstance, of not asking direct questions of people and then having statements made that are told to a non-Aboriginal art coordinator frequently that become the sort of script for that work that automatically can translate to the wall label in the museum, but is only one take, and that denies the very point that you're making, Harvey, which is that it could be anything that somebody wants to make of it as well. And so that maybe goes to this idea, and that you're getting to, Will, is what are the issues that are prescribing Aboriginal art, that are causing challenges to it today? And what is this difference between Australia and America? What are the things that we cannot talk about as easily in Australia as here in America?
Well, this isn't directly an answer to that. I just want to discuss the question of when people first see this art, whether they're bored with it as Bob was when he first saw it, or whether they're amazed and just start telling everybody they know, go and see this. What you were describing, I can understand if it was not very good, say, bark paintings and things like that. But our experience at Dartmouth was that each of the three shows that we've had, each one drew more and more people from a wider and wider area. And my impression was that when people who first saw, especially these very brightly colored acrylic paintings, they were just amazed and excited. And then they start to learn about what it's all about. And probably some of them never even care about what the artist was trying to do or what the cultural context of the production of that work is and so on, but they just love it, and purely as a reaction, which is either something like universal, or maybe it's in our culture to just be excited about very bright and you know, op art, things that have a visual impression that just hits you immediately. And so looking at the idea of how to get more people to know about it and see it, I'm sort of optimistic about in this country, once the each show could influence museum directors in other places to be a little more inclined to give it a shot and get it out there and just see what happens. And it may, and I think that gradually there will be more shows of really good art, and those who are taking a chance of doing that will spread the word, and slowly it'll happen, and it'll happen because of word of mouth, people telling their friends. But the other thing, actually, Harvey mentioned a television show. People could be exposed to it initially by a T-shirt or a show or some commercial product that's a licensed thing, and then they think, "Wow, that's interesting. I'd like to know more about it," and this might draw them into the museum. You people know a lot better than I do about what makes an American go to a museum, and but I think that they might first be exposed to it in some mass media way, maybe in a movie or something like that, and then think, oh, I'd like to go to this you know, the exhibit that's showing in some local place. And so, my perception was that the art was selling itself. Once people saw it, they were interested, but the challenge was to get them to go and see it in the first place.
I've got a question, Brian. When you decided to have this show here, what kind of a response did you get from your membership/board? Did they say, "Oh, I've seen that stuff before. I loved it"?
Well, no, I mean, maybe it's something particular to this museum, but the board here doesn't interfere in the decisions around exhibition making. So they're decisions that we deliver.
But no, their
and
response.
Their response was, "That sounds great," but it was part of a discussion. It's a general discussion around our art committee, which is about our acquisition making committee, which is a subcommittee of the board. And these people are, very intensely interested in art, most of them collectors. And the broader framework from the beginning of my time here has been, how do we take this great classic museum and attempt to, as you'd say, Adam, to globalize it and localize it at the same time. So how do we celebrate the art of our people and our region, which we don't collect unless you're the best artist in America. This is a very hard civic museum to be in, but we show it, but we want to reach out. And so I think there was just this great appetite for wanting to be international.
The reason I ask is the Toledo Art Museum has tours that go around to various cities of members, and they go to private collections. And most of them, I think, are emphasizing glass. And a group came to Seattle, and a group came through our house, and a number of people at these openings have come up to me and say, "Oh, I remember we saw it at your house." And I wonder if that did anything.
Yeah,
I mean, going back to this question, whether they retained any of that, or it was, "That's interesting, let's go on to see the glass we want to see," and then all of a sudden it's recalled because you're having a show, or whether there was something that stayed with them.
No, I think it's to do with the power structure. I mean, the ambassadors could go and have that trip, and some said to me last evening, really that was the most exciting part of our visit. These people had all these works of art in their house, and then they had another house, and it was full of more works of art. And now we have this here. There was this sense of great excitement, but people can see lots of things, but the control structure exists with the administration, really. I mean, the reaction that's already taken place here has been very exciting. You could see the numbers of people, a full house yesterday for our discussion. In the security guards and our volunteers and our ambassadors and our docents, our staff, all who have gone through in previews or business council,
it's just
the appetite is just...
It's just how much exposure does it take before you become supportive or enthusiastic or whatever, as opposed to, "Oh, that was an interesting episode."
There's a bit of preconditioning. Last year, for Australia Day, we like having parties here, right? So we had an Australia Day party. Remember, Claude? And so we put these sort of facts about Australia, and everybody sang Waltzing Matilda. And we had I had this video of, not video, but a slideshow of images that I'd taken in the Australian desert, and of Aboriginal people making paintings. And so that was all there. So there's a degree of preconditioning that's over a period of time. And, personally I find, I'm Irish and Australian in citizenship right now. These are two great countries to come from. There's not a lot of baggage that people hold against you, It's a pretty good thing. So Australia in the popular mind is one of the places that's top of list for I'd love to visit, and it keeps coming out that way. So I think that it's very much your point, Henry, that to go on the front foot on this, there's probably a lot to be gained.
But to continue with that though, one of the dangers here is that we have, and this has been, I've been in the United States for 2 years. I cannot imagine arriving at a better time for Aboriginal art. I've got to come to so many of these terrific jamborees.
Your timing's been impeccable.
It's perfect. But to make this, if the question is the future has to be more than a passing fad. And one of the things that we see from the history of art is that, the Renaissance art was very popular, and then it was replaced by the Baroque art, and then it was replaced by the whole history of European art that follows. We can't talk about this work as having great visual impact, and that's going to excite people, and that's going to have a long-term lasting impact. I just don't believe that. And I believe that the answer has to be the conversations. The conversations that we insert this work into the global art narrative. And I'm glad that you brought up Marina Abramovic. Marina Abramovic is a great example. Who were, I can't really defend art historians. They took a while to come around to Aboriginal art. But I'll argue that when they did come around to Aboriginal art, they did an exceptionally good job on it, in some cases. But who did come around to Aboriginal art very early on? Non-Indigenous artists. Marina Abramovic travels out to the desert because she's heard about Panyatula artists. Ian Byrne writes some amazing things on Aboriginal art. Vivian Johnson's husband. Tim Johnson. There you go. I don't know how many people have referred to him as Vivian Johnson's husband before. But what are these artists seeing in this work? And I don't think that any of those artists, with perhaps the exception of Tim, I'll include Tim Johnson. I don't think any of those artists saw this work as just being beautiful work. They saw this work as critically engaging in the key questions that they were interested in, the key questions of contemporary art. And to me, that's about conversations. It's why this question of how we locate Aboriginal art with global contemporary art is so important. And I was giving an example on the shuttle over. We teach a course at the University of Pittsburgh called Introduction to Contemporary Art, and this semester it had 200 students, and the textbook for that course has 400 images in it, of which it has 8 Aboriginal artworks, which I think is a really good proportion. And I had the fortune of giving this lecture I had 45 minutes to lecture on the history of contemporary art in Australia, and I ran this narrative trying to think about how is the conceptual work of Ian Byrne related to what the artists in Panyatula were doing in the 70s, 80s, and it's it has conversation. There are discussions that are occurring across those works. For the final exam, which the students are sitting next week, one of the questions that we're setting is compare an Emmeline Warai painting with a Mel Euclid's photograph. And the photograph, for those of you who don't know the work that she did in the 1980s, she took a photograph of herself shaking hands with every single sanitation worker in New York City. All right, so immediately you've got 2 works produced roughly contemporaneously, both of them interested in. We can immediately see those things are interested in very similar questions of the ways in which we relate to the world, the ways in which we relate to the landscape. But they're approaching it from radically different cultural contexts. Now, the importance for me in doing something like that is that most of the students in that class would consider painting to be a retrograde art form. The students who are doing contemporary art want to look at installation art, they want to look at Marina Abramovic. So we've got a dual issue here, that if we want to be inserting Aboriginal art into conversations that people think are advanced conversations, that are relevant conversations, we also need to be thinking about it conceptually as well, as aesthetically. So
but it's not either or. That's the
it doesn't
point.
have to be.
That's the thing. It's not either or. All of these things count.
And I think that what you're doing is really important in, broadening knowledge about world art and in a much more inclusive way. At the University of Virginia, I teach a course just on Australian Aboriginal art, and so that we go into a much deeper understanding. And some of those students have gone on to be interns at the Colloquium Museum, which is the only museum in the United States that only focuses on Australian Aboriginal art, and I think has an important role. When you I don't think there's a museum in Australia that focuses on Native American art. I may be wrong,
or
but
Australian Aboriginal art. Really.
Yeah, I mean, there's just this one and then the one in Utrecht, I think, that are kind of devoted to that area. But some students and former interns have gone on to jobs at other museums that have resulted in exhibitions of Aboriginal art at those museums, and certainly in broader knowledge that's out there. And I think it is key that we are training the next generation of you know, curators and conservators and, you know, people who are going to be in these positions to make the choices.
Brian, can I jump in with a segue, having heard the word Utrecht? As you know, I'm an outsider to this discipline, only an art historian curator. I was in Utrecht and was in that museum just a couple of weeks ago, in fact. And Brian's asked a question a moment ago. I think the last outstanding question, in fact, was what's proscribing greater access to understanding Aboriginal art from Australia. I was with the University of Amsterdam professor and visited that museum, and also encountered others visiting it as well. And I perceived what we were all doing was appreciating what we were looking at from a Western aesthetic point of view, enjoying the colors and the forms and the shapes. But I was also cognizant that I was not understanding one level of the works of art. And I'm reminded of yesterday Brian's remarks and referencing your statements to the degree of, if I've got the vocabulary right, registers of knowledge. Segue. I once taught an introductory art history survey course at Columbia, and a woman from the subcontinent of India comes up to me during the break and says, "Mr. Nichols, you're talking about the iconography of Amiens Cathedral's facade. I don't understand it at all. What should I read?" Brian's point yesterday, the scientific inquiry that some have in the globe of wanting to understand and being able to do so if you have the right sources to do so. Without being glib, I encourage this woman to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of the New Testament of the Bible, because that would help her achieve her aim. So here's my statement then about Brian's question of what's proscribing access to Aboriginal art as I'm learning more about it. I'm aware that some access to understanding will be deliberately denied me. And that's okay, I can accept that and understand it, or accept it. But I'm pointing out, Brian, then in answer to your question, when I'm walking through Utrecht, when I'm walking through upstairs, I'm aware that I'm not going to understand everything that the artist made it for and the context there. So I'm back to Harvey's remark about that first visual, passionate response in 1980, whatever it was, 9 or 8. It was eyes and enjoyment. So I'll conclude my statement by saying, you were talking about what is the aesthetics, values, and systems. There's no less than 2 aesthetic systems going on, no less than, because am I going to understand this show completely? Am I allowed to understand this show completely? And I say show meaning Aboriginal art. I muse that way for you all to realize something you likely already know. Somebody absolutely neophyte to this material becomes aware. You're not going to be aware of everything. And that's a prescription, Brian, then, I think.
Can I jump in on that too? Neophyte to neophyte, and to tie it back into the exam question. So the amazing thing about that is that's no different than anything else in the museum, right? I study early Christian art, right? This is typology, right? This is how an image of an Old Testamental figure prefigures for someone with the requisite knowledge, Christ, right? This is artist intent, right? I can respond to something without knowing what the intentionality of the artist was, right? What he or she was trying to do. So to like the museum as the venue for discourse, museums are very good at periodizing and telling a certain historical narrative. What museums are very bad at, and apropos something you've suggested to do here, which conversations, is juxtapose one thing against another and let people make their own interpretations, right? And what's really interesting is how those interpretations diverge, but there are lots of objects with which, whether it's an early Christian sarcophagus or an abstract Western work of art, right, with which an contemporary Aboriginal painting can converse. So museums really do have a role, but I also think it's in rethinking installation strategies, right? So it's not just in getting it in there in its own shows. And it actually is easier to do it this way because you actually need way fewer artworks to undertake that project. You can move works around from gallery to gallery. So
the question that you track is, did you want to know more? Because it has to be appealing enough for you to want to know.
Oh, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
I was responding to it. I didn't go in there merely because I knew we were about to have this wonderful exhibit. I went there because I lived there for 2.5 years and I foolishly had never been there. It actually had been open since I lived there. But I went there because I wanted to see this material, realizing it's a domain I knew nothing about that was valid. And then I felt, and this is my problem, but I'm still answering the Brian inquiry, what's prescribing greater access? I felt denied the capacity for full understanding. And I think that's still, I anticipate thinkers experiencing this show here till July 4th will really say, I want more. Let me have it.
Well, and what I'm saying is there are two strategies for doing that, and this is to the line with sculptors of Renaissance Germany, right? Crow and Baxendale. One way to do that is to try and familiarize the artwork. The other is to defamiliarize the works of art that are in museum collections currently, right? So you say you want to learn more, and I'm saying another way of achieving it is just to invert the problem and say you really don't know that much about the stuff that's on display here.
Well, that's very likely true, says one who's accountable for understanding it. But I could theoretically understand it. What I'm learning from what I'm listening in the last few hours and days and months is that there is some access that's being not permitted to me for valid reasons that I'm not challenging, but I'm just pointing out that that's going to present problems to getting beyond the Harvey aesthetic response merely initially.
Well, but there are, and maybe we need to make this clear, there are levels, as Stephen said, there are registers. You can spend, and I think I'm living proof of this, 20 years and not get through all the stuff that you are allowed to know.
Yeah.
You know, when you're talking about truly prescribed levels of knowledge in indigenous societies, you're talking about a point that people get to over a course of 40 years.
But look at the PT write-ups. Papunya 2 write-up says, this is the Tungaris were such and so, and we can't tell you anymore because the rest of it is secret Tenkari business that only senior men can know. And and that's thrown right in your face at the beginning, and that's the
point I'm making. My student from Bombay, were she to want to, could understand everything there is about medieval iconography, but that's not the case with the what's being discussed presently.
Again, I'll say two things. The positive thing first. I think that it is essential to understanding Aboriginal art that you understand that there are things that are denied to you. I think that is a critical piece of appreciating this art. The second thing that I will say about Papunya in particular is, if I understand the history correctly, the primary reason they do that is to divert your attention away from the story and to try to force you, and I think it's a stupid strategy, but to try to force you to look at this as art and not as anthropology.
The other comment is that there are things, if I were a fully initiated Aboriginal male, there are things that I would not know that Margot, as a fully initiated Aboriginal woman, would know. And so that it's, even within that community, there's secret.
And I think Francoise Dussat has made the point that actually a lot of that stuff that Margot knows that you don't know, you really know, you just
Right.
don't admit it.
And I think there's a lot of the stuff that we don't know, we know too.
But speaking of Francoise, you know, Francoise is fluent in Walbury, and the language makes a huge, huge difference. And so, and many of the people who work as intermediaries aren't fluent in the language, and I think that sometimes the information that's given, that, you know, when you purchase a work, reflects that, you know, they get a bare bones, you know, statement. They sometimes recycle those statements. You read them over and over again on different works of art. And so I think, you know, really what's called for is more of this conversation. If we want a deeper understanding, and we're going to have to do it on the terms of the people who are making the art, we're going to have to come to them and you know, learn their words for the aesthetics, you know, in their own culture, and figure out how that translates. And, you know, make that a part of our understanding. Don't we do that with every other, you know, area of art? So we can do that now. There are people who are, you know, able to do that level of translation. And I think Margaret and Bob have been talking about doing a project with interviews with artists, and you know, getting that deep level of understanding and doing it now.
The public doesn't even understand dreaming.
Yeah. I think there's so many different levels of understanding, let's say, a piece of Aboriginal art, and that different people would be satisfied with a different amount of knowledge. And those works that have been made public, there's been discussions among the artists and so on about what can be revealed to the outsider, and so many buyers, whether they're interested or not, they do expect there to be a little story that they get along with the work. And it'll be the public version, which even children can know. And the emu being went over here and made this water hole and had this fight and threw this stick and so on. And for many people, that's already getting pretty deep in, and maybe the fact that the initiated male elder would know, oh, but you don't really know that thing was really left there by somebody else, and they had a conflict and so on. And in principle, there could be even deeper levels of meaning that the elders don't know, and how far down do you need to drill to be satisfied that you understand the actual work of art. So I think that many people are viewing it in a very superficial way, and they're satisfied with that. Others, scholars and so forth, will try to learn deeper meanings and backstories and relationships between different pieces of art. I think that probably even Western art, I think the idea that what the artist has to say, but like Harvey was saying, at a certain point he didn't really want to know any more about that. You could have a work of art that you could interpret the iconic, you know, the figurative meanings would be clear enough. And then if you know that the artist was really expressing his hatred for his mother-in-law or something like that, that would be something you don't actually need to know to appreciate the work. And I think that maybe at the most superficial level, that's the starting point for most people. Do they respond to it? Do they find it exciting and interesting and so on? And some people just stop there. They think, boy, I'd like to have that on my wall. I'll get a poster of it, and they're satisfied with that level.
I want to make a suggestion. It's an academic suggestion, so it's aimed at Henry.
I'm not nice anyway.
Whatever.
Here's a demo for them tonight.
You're teaching students, 200 at a clip, a new way of looking at world art. You're a few hours drive away from here to where you teach. Try to get a little bus full and bring them here, and let them look at the show, and have one of these situations like we have this morning, where you ask them these questions about, okay, you know something about art, and you know, they can be self-chosen as to who goes on the bus, not under it, on it, and let them articulate. Did they like it? Didn't they like it? Well, you have this little card. How do you feel about this exhibition? But I mean, get deeper than that, like this conversation is, and see what clings to their understanding of world art in the face of some world art.
You know, and that's something we have a lot of trouble with in Pittsburgh. You know, we have a magnificent museum that's built very much on this single narrative of Western art history. It's very hard, you know. But when it comes down to that thing about conversations, I really do think the key to that is having the right conversations. And so, you know,
but you would lead the conversation
oh,
because
no.
you have a point of view about how initiates come to understand world art. You're teaching them, and it's a point of view, right? It's not your point of view. I mean, a personal point of view, but the point of view that you're expressing in your courses it's not the point of view that's expressed in all courses, even in the United States, let alone the rest of the world. So it would be a way of testing whether that point of view leads initiates, right, to respond to what they see.
And you know, to return to Brian's question, you know, what's the possibilities and difficulties of approaching this in the United States? What I would say is what I see as the single great possibility of it here is that people, as Will said, don't come to it necessarily with the same baggage. So you can stand in front of 200 undergraduates in America and say, this is the most advanced contemporary art being produced in the world today. And they will write, this is the most advanced right. And they will believe that, and they will have that conversation. And that's why, to me, it is so radically important that we are situating this work alongside the most radical work being produced today. And that doesn't mean putting a Mark Rothko and a Rover Thomas next to each other. That means, you know, putting Rover Thomas next to his contemporaries. Let's think, you know, who was another painter who used natural materials in his canvases, who talked about history, about time, about trauma. Does that sound like Rover Thomas, or does that sound like Anselm Kiefer? You know, who were both working in the 1980s. Mark Rothko was working in the 1940s and 50s. Now, what we need to be saying is, we're dealing here with advanced contemporary art. Advanced contemporary art, the best in the world. And that's, you know, that's what I want the 200 kids to come away. We're not allowed to say kids. 200 students to come away and say at the end of their course, to say, heck, you know, in the middle of nowhere, there are men and women in the Australian desert in Ireland who are making the best work in the world today.
Can I intercede just to say that I think that, you know, being in the American Association of Art Museum Directors, about 220, and I would say a handful or less have had exhibitions of Australian Aboriginal art. And so it's a challenge that has been manifested now twice when we tried to place exhibitions, and really there was no take-up. And we tried to explore why that hasn't taken place. And I've been considering this and wondering about an alternate strategy, that if we believe that certain works of art have the capacity within them to really inspire and to take their place within museums, we need to look to the idea of individual works or small groups of works potentially entering into the museum, where the strategy that has been employed is that we've wanted to have whole exhibitions there. And that has had a history which has been progressive and helpful. But you know, within a museum, it's often just, what's that? You know, where's that from? And it might be your first Monty and Boonma you know, from Thailand. It might be some extraordinary artist that you've never seen before, Dadang Kristanto from Indonesia. You know, it's people that people don't really know here at all, but see one work and their spirits rise and say, that's extraordinary. And so as a strategy, in terms of the placement of individual works within museums, would that have the capacity, because it would have the directorial prerogative to accept them, of course? Because I'm wondering, the alternative strategy is when you're trying to have exhibitions, you have to go generally, unless you're the person who happens to know about it yourself, you know, it's in my case, there'd be no reason to have it here, other than somebody had to be able to mediate it in some way or other, and that was me, and now it's others too. But in the absence of that, most American museum directors, they may never have been to Australia, never mind being exposed to Australian Aboriginal art. So they rely on somebody within the curatorial staff to have been, and maybe that's not the case either. So I'd sort of turn that to you, Larry, and say, and you're a distinguished member of the American Association of Art Museum Curators, what's the framework there as to why this is proving difficult?
Yesterday morning at 8:45, I went in the show upstairs for the first time. And I went to that last room. And on that last wall, where Brian, Claude, and I, in the previous show, hung one Manet painting, now hang two remarkable pictures. I think those pictures belong in the Museum of Modern Art, or the Toledo Museum of Art, or the Hood Museum of Art. Qualitatively, they're fabulous, and I respond to them visually, and I want to know more about them, hence my remarks earlier on. I think it's just experience, Brian, that will take place to garner greater awareness. I'm keen to walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art someday, correct me if I'm wrong, and see this material on regular view. I love going in that side entrance and coming up into the Art of Africa, and you go rotating one gallery space there. I always go there to learn Indonesian batik and masks and the like. Someday there'll be Aboriginal art there and here and elsewhere. So you put a question to a colleague, curator, friend, how do we get going here? And an answer is, at AAMD, say, look what we just bought. Implication, we did it before you. And then it'll in 1867 or 8, is my head still in Manet or what? He put on a private show because the Universal Fair was going on, where millions went. 5,000 people went to his private show. Okay? Now Manet, that show is open in the Royal Academy tonight till midnight. They're lining up to see it. My point is plain. Acceptance comes sometimes over time. Not everybody's Michelangelo or Raphael, Il Divino. And so I think curators, whether they're specialists in the area or not, and directors here and in the Louvre, need to buy this material or accept it as gifts. In any case, access it to the collection. Because then the public will have the Harvey experience of realizing visually it's powerful and life-changing. And then my question of the levels of understanding access, and again, I'm not challenging it, I'm just throwing it out there. It does present a hurdle, because that clever Indian student could understand everything about Christian iconography. But there's going to need to be a teaching of acceptance that you don't have to understand everything. And that's the culture and the way of these fellow human beings.
And you know, I was thinking that Harvey used to have a work by an artist named Stephen Antonakis. And if we adopted Adam's strategy, there were two packages that the artist created, wrapped up in brown paper, took to the post office and mailed to Harvey's address when he was living in Connecticut. And on one of them it was written something like, "To be opened September 1st, 1999. And on the other one it was written, "Never to be opened." Put that next to a secret, sacred Aboriginal painting from the desert in a gallery and say, here. think about that. That would be wonderful. Wouldn't it? Yes.
And I think it's
Because I was so angry at that Antonakis word.
That's a good example, Pear. I'll keep that one.
But I think it's human. We're talking about human nature as well. Some people will be okay with accepting that they're not meant to know and it's off limits. Some people, I'm actually okay with that. But there are some people that have this quest and want to know more. But I think we're also kind of putting the cart before the horse a bit here, because I agree totally with what you're saying, and that the discussion has to be a clever discussion, a scholarly discussion. But we have to get people in front of the works. We have to start somewhere. And I think there's been some really fabulous things happening in America, and it has started. And so I think that we should feel enthused about what we're seeing. And yes, you will see a collection at the Met, and I don't think it's that far away. You know, it does take time, and we're actually talking about a recent period of collecting history here. We're talking about 40 years, really. So look at what's happened in the past decade, where there's been this momentum shift. And look at this conversation we're having today outside of Australia. Who in Australia are having these conversations? That's what, you know, and I think there's great possibilities, and this is a fantastic forum, and I think it would be wonderful to see more of this happening so we can get to some of these important, we need to address the way it's discussed once you get people on board, but you've got to get people on board first. And that's the conversation we're trying, how do we do that? And you know, and then you have questions, well, do you show it as a collection? Do you separate it? Do you know, how do we place the artwork in front of a public audience? And some of it, I think, you know, let's start with get the kids on the bus, get them over here, let them talk, let them ask the questions. But more of it has to happen. And we're all doing our bit, I think, and seeing how that happens. And then we can get into the nitty-gritty of, okay, but you've got to get it in front of people.
But I think that's what's going to happen over the next couple of months here in Toledo. This has been a very rich conversation, and almost a sort of reciprocal conversation to to the discussion that took place at Dartmouth College when this exhibition opened there, which was a panel where people gave presentations, and each of the people on that panel was Indigenous Australian, and that was facilitated and brought into being by Stephen Gilchrist, who has also helped us to come together by curating Crossing Cultures at the Hood Museum of Art, and then being able to come here. And so we've had this, if it's like reciprocity, which is not ideal, but a start, which is that an Indigenous panel of 4 speakers presented, each presenting a paper, and here it's been in the conversation format around the table, where we've offered perspectives from non-Indigenous points of view, but some deeply knowledgeable points of view from people from Australia, people who spent time in Australia, people who studied deeply in Australian art, people who've collected Australian Aboriginal art. And so we hope that this conversation, in the various ways that we can disseminate it, sponsors others and contributes to dialogue. And so let me thank each of you for being here and for your contributions, and we look forward to the responses that they'll bring. Thanks indeed.